Hello, hope everyone is doing well, and welcome to the first in a series of online classes we're going to be running over the next few weeks. These classes are going to cover a range of digital skills from 2D and 3D modelling within Rhino to the creation of both interior and exterior perspective views, and using these in combination with Photoshop and Illustrator to kind of work them up and get the most out of your projects. These sessions will act as both a recap of some of the work we've done in the previous term and also an introduction to some new techniques which will be coming over the coming weeks. I will be uploading a new session each week, and each of these sections are going to be broken down into a series of chapters, with the aim of these chapters being about 10 to 20 minutes long each. This first session will focus on 2D drawing within Rhino, and particularly focusing on the creation of the plan drawing. Also within the description of each video, we'll break down all the techniques we're covering in the video and kind of give timestamps to each of those, so you can fast forward if you know certain bits or track back if you kind of want to recap anything we're covering. Throughout the next few weeks, I'm going to be using an example project to work through and kind of use as a base of the drawings we're going to be working on. This project is the Robin Hood Gardens estate in East London. An image of it is here. This is a residential estate that has now been partially demolished to make way for a new redevelopment scheme in the area, and we're going to be focusing in on one of the flats in this residential scheme. The flats are quite interesting because they're split over 2 levels and they have a kind of communal entranceway, which we'll be going into in more detail as we start to draw this up. I will also be attaching these images and any other kind of assets I'm using through the course of these sessions with the videos as I upload them. We are going to be working from this image of a typical flat layout in the Robin Hood Gardens estate, and I'm going to be using this as a kind of base reference to draw off and start to work up my plan drawing. So to begin with, I'm just going to go through the basic setup within Rhino, and then we're going to start on the drawing. I'm expecting you all to be following along using your own projects and not this example, as you've kind of all got projects that are going on at the moment, and it'd be really good to use these techniques within your own work as you're following along with this video. So to begin, I'm just going to close these images down, and I've just opened up a new Rhino file. Because we're going to be working mostly in the 2D view, I'm going to maximize my top screen here, and we're just going to be working in this window for the time being. So the first thing I'm going to do before I start any drawing work is to check the units my file's in. So to do that, just go up to File and Properties, and then under the Units tab here, it will tell you what units your Rhino file is set up in. You pretty much always want to be working in millimeters, and you'll find when you start working in practice that all companies will work within millimeters, so always try and work in millimeters all the time. And with that selected, just hit OK. The next thing I want to check are my snaps, and these will make sure that while I'm drawing, all my lines are snapping correctly together and joining up correctly. And it's really important that these are always on to make sure your drawing is always kind of align and snap correctly. If you don't have these tick boxes at the bottom of your Rhino file, you just have to click on the O snap here. This turns them on or off, so make sure that that's turned on, and by default I have these 6 snaps turned on all the time, and that's the end. I usually don't have the near snap on because that can kind of ruin the other snaps along lines, and it's kind of good to turn it off for that point. So make sure you kind of have these 6 always turned on while you're drawing. The next point I just want to check before I start doing any drawing work are my layer setup. So whenever I do 2D drawing, I make a layer folder called 2D line work, and this will be where all my lines that I'm drawing will be contained. I'm not going to go into these at too much detail at this stage, but just a quick overview. My section lines are for anything I'm cutting through, and I've got 3 different thicknesses of those. Elevation lines are anything that you can see in the drawing but that's not being cut. Hatch lines are for any sort of surface finish of any materials. Annotations are kind of annotations or door swings or any arrows on your drawing. Above is anything that might be above the drawing, and below is anything that could be below it, and these are usually dotted lines. And my guidelines are reference lines I'm going to be using in the drawing, but that will be invisible when I go to kind of printing it out. So these are really useful to help set out your drawings to a grid or to set out center points or objects, and you'll find I'm going to be using these quite a lot to help me kind of reference and set up my drawings. With those things now set up, I can now begin my drawing. So I'm going to be using a reference file to draw off for this, and we've kind of done this before in other lessons. I've sort of used Google Maps, or you could be using a sketch. It's exactly the same technique. This is just a JPEG image of a typical floor layout, and we're going to be importing this into Rhino and then scaling it up so we can use it as a reference. So to do that, I'm just going to select the image from my file and drag it into Rhino. We're going to select a picture to import it in, and then we're just going to draw it out as a frame into Rhino. Don't worry about the scale of this yet, because we'll now be scaling it up to be the right size. As a general point in Rhino, you should always be drawing at 1:1 scale. You should never draw at different scales within Rhino, and so anything that's 2 meters long should be drawn at 2 meters within Rhino. So for this image, I need to make sure that these dimensions are correctly scaled within my Rhino file. I'm just going to check those to start with, just using a Polyline tool and drawing along one of these lines. When you draw using the line tool, you can check the distance of the line you're drawing just to this box down at the bottom. So if I just hover over that point there, it's telling me that that's 740 millimeters long, so that's a bit short at the moment. I want this to be 1.38 meters. So in order to scale this up correctly, I'm going to start by just drawing a line that's this scale, 1.38 meters long, so that's 1380, and just doing that by typing in the value in the line box and hitting enter. And then I'm just going to hold down the shift key to lock that horizontally, and then left click to finish the line. So that line is now exactly 1.38 meters long. Now, using that line as a reference, I'm going to scale up my image so it matches the length of that line. So to do that, I'm going to select the image. I'm going to select Scale 2D tool on the right hand side here, right click. It asks me for a base point, so I'm going to select the start of the line. Asks me for a reference point, which will be the kind of reference scale that we're using in the image, which is here. And then we just drag that along to match the line we've drawn. And now my reference is scaled to the correct scale. And to check that, I'm just going to delete this line. We can draw another line, maybe along this dimension here, and have a look down at my dimensions. And that's pretty much, it's just off slightly, but because I'm using an image, there'll be a slight sort of tolerance error. So that's pretty much on 2 meters. I'm happy with that. So this is now scaled correctly to the kind of correct dimensions that we can then start drawing off from it and using it as a reference layer to draw from. Another point to note is that my reference is currently sitting in the active layer that I dragged it into, which is this section thick line layer. I actually want this reference to be on its own layer, so I'm able to lock it and kind of avoid moving it or accidentally scaling it while I'm drawing. So to do that, I'm just going to select my reference, go to the object properties here, and change the layer by selecting the layer from this drop down, and I've just made a reference layer here. We can then check that that's moved in just by turning this on and off, and yes, that's now in the correct layer. I'm now going to lock that so I can't accidentally select it while I'm drawing. So now we're going to start the basic drawing work of our file. We're going to start with the outer line in our drawing and then kind of work inwards. Whenever you're doing any 2D line work in Rhino, you're going to be mostly using the Polyline tool to draw with. And the reason you want to use this tool is that as you draw, it creates a chain of lines that are automatically linked together. And when you finish the chain, it creates what they call a closed curve. This is really important when we're starting to move into 2D modelling, that we can then extrude those curves and make them into 3D shapes. So it's quite important you're always sort of drawing in Polyline. Now we're going to start with this outside wall here, and I'm going to be using the Polyline just to sort of trace around this outside edge. So I'm just going to start with this inner corner and holding down the shift key, I'm then going to drag it across to the next corner. Now I'm not just going to click where I roughly think that point is, because I want my dimensions to be sort of whole round numbers, and this is quite important when you're drawing out any plans or any drawings to start with, because whenever you bring a sketch in to Rhino, it will never be perfectly accurate. So you then want to build in that accuracy while you're modelling it up in CAD. So I'm just going to note what kind of value it is there, and that's about 5,200 millimeters. So instead of clicking, I'm actually going to type that number in and then hit enter, hold down shift to lock it, and then left click. So now instead of sort of randomly clicking and drawing a line, I've drawn a line that's exactly 5,200 millimeters long. And this is quite important moving forward, that we keep whole numbers. Then it gets sort of easier to divide and set up grid lines, and everything just is much more straightforward when you do that from the start. So we're going to do the same, this line, hold down shift, sort of note roughly what distance that is. That's about 7,650, so type that in. And then left click, and now we've got the first two lines. Now, if I wanted to draw my next line to match the distance and length of this first one to make this a perfect rectangle, we should start by holding down shift, but you'll find if you try and snap it to match that length, it will just automatically want to join up those lines there. So in order to keep this locked in that horizontal plane, if we hold down the shift key and then press the tab key and then let go of all keys, it will then lock that line in that horizontal plane. What we can then do is go up and select the point we started from, and that will now match the length of that line that we first drew. Then all we have to do is finish the loop, and that's now created a closed rectangle, which you can see if I turn off the reference there. We're now going to give this wall some thickness. You'll notice that the walls drawn on this reference are quite thin, and actually I think for this example I'm going to make the wall a bit thicker. So to do that, we're going to be using the offset tool, and this is a really useful tool for creating kind of thicknesses in walls or offsetting any lines that you've drawn. So if you type in offset, you'll notice that what it does is it creates a copy of your line, and it moves it or offsets it a set distance from the original line you've drawn. So mine is currently at a distance of 50. So I actually want my wall thickness to be around 300 mil, and if you're doing any external walls of a building, a good sort of dimension to start with, if you're not sure exactly how it's going to be built or what it's going to be made out of, should be around 300 mil. So I'm going to just type that in and hit enter, and you'll see that that's now changed the distance of my offset to 300. If you're happy with that, then you can left click. You can also put the offset on the inside if you wanted, but this one's going to be the outside of the line. So I'm going to left click, and that's now created an offset line on my box. So I've got my kind of wall thickness, and this is my perimeter or external wall of this flat. Now before we go any further and do any more drawing, I'm going to start to set up some basic guidelines which are going to help me with my drawing as I move forward. So I'm going to just double click on my guide layer to make that my active layer, and I'm going to start by just drawing a center guideline along the midpoint of this. You'll notice that because my mid snaps are on, I can snap right in the middle of this rectangle, and I'm just going to extend this kind of overboard of the wall just so it's slightly up, and move it upwards so it's chopping that rectangle directly in half. Also, so I don't confuse this line with any other lines, I'm going to change the line type of this for a dashed line here, and you can just do that by clicking on the line type, and I'm going to change it to, maybe let's just try it hidden for now. This scale of the line type kind of depends on the scale you specified in here, so you'll see it's very small because I'm working in millimeters at the moment, and this will be more visible when you actually go to print out or lay out your drawings, but for now that's kind of fine. So we're going to do one center line, then we're also going to do guidelines on the inner face of these external walls here, and I've just done that by copying that center line and snapping it to each of those faces, and then we're going to create one for the inner face on these walls up here. Don't worry too much about kind of joining these, as long as they're sitting accurately on the lines you want them to. It doesn't matter, because these lines are going to be invisible when we go to print our drawings, that they can kind of just overhang a bit on the drawings, like so. And once we've created those, I'm going to go back to my section layer and lock my guide layer. You'll see when you lock any layer that it will automatically go behind the layers you're drawing, and this is quite useful so you don't accidentally select it later on. we're now going to start to draw out some of our internal walls on this flat. These are these walls here and here, and they've got kind of varying thicknesses going on here, so I'm going to actually just unify that and make a typical thickness for an internal wall. For my internal walls, I'm going to be using the section mid layer because it's not a primary piece of structure. I want it to be slightly differentiated from my external wall. So I'm going to be using this line type, which will be slightly thinner when we go to print it. So I'm going to select Polyline again. We'll start with this wall, and I'm just going to kind of overhang it off the external wall there, and just holding down Shift to lock it in place. I'm also drawing it in quite a rough position for now, and we're going to be moving it into a more accurate location later on. So I'm just going to draw the first one and finish that line. And then to give it a thickness, we'll use offset again. But instead of 300, because it's an internal wall, I'm going to do it at a distance of 125, which is the typical internal timber wall thickness you might have. That would be a timber wall with a plasterboard finish, for example. So we're just going to do that. And then we're going to copy these internal wall just up to this one, holding down Shift again to lock that in the vertical, and up to this point here. So you see we've got 3 internal walls there. For this vertical one, I'm just going to take one of these internal walls I've drawn, and I'm going to use the rotate 2D function. If we select the rotate tool, and before we start rotating, we can actually ask it to copy the line as well while we're rotating it. So it saves us having to use the copy tool and then the rotate tool. We can do it all in one. So if we just click yes to copy, and then select the midpoint, and just hold down Shift and rotate it 90 degrees, like so. Then got that midline. I'm just going to roughly kind of move it down. We'll be moving this into its proper place in a bit. Now you see that all these lines have kind of extra bits of line hanging over the external wall, so we want to get rid of those, and to do that we're going to be using the trim tool. The trim tool can be found here in your menu, or you can type in trim, and all it asks for is a cutting line, which will be the line we're going to be using to trim off those ends. So it's going to be this internal wall line here. Then we hit enter, and then it asks you to just select the objects you want to trim. So you can either click each of these in turn, or if you want to do them all at the same time, you can kind of draw out a box over them, and it will chop them all, like so. And we're going to do the same for this line here. You'll notice as you start to use commands, you don't have to type in the whole word as well. I can just type in TR or even T, and it will sort of learn that you're wanting to use trim, and then trim those off. We're now going to move these walls a bit more accurately into place, and we're going to be setting up some more grid lines to help us do that. So firstly, if I just look back at my reference, this centre wall is kind of on that centre line, and I actually want the wall in my drawing to be perfectly centred. So we're going to move these 2 lines so their midpoint matches the midpoint of this centre grid line we've drawn here. To do that, I'm just going to find their midpoint snap and just draw a line connecting the 2, and we're going to use that to move our 2 lines from that midpoint onto our grid line here, like so, and then delete that guideline. So now that wall is perfectly centered up. We can then trim this little line here, so these lines will join up. I also want my internal walls to all have a kind of equal distance between them. If I have a look on my reference, it kind of looks like some of them about 880mm, and this one might be a bit shorter. It's about 900, it's a bit longer. So actually I kind of want to make all these distances between my internal walls exactly the same. So to do that, I'm just going to kind of take a rough value. I think about 850 should do it. And we're going to be using my guidelines to set this out. So I'm just going to copy this guideline down, 850. I've just copied and locked that vertically down. and then we're just going to move our internal walls up to match that line. And I'm just going to copy these 850 separated guidelines down so I can then line them up with my internal walls. And it's quite good to just set up these grid lines as you go along, because they help keep your drawing sort of nice and orderly and everything in its correct place. Once I've done that, I'm then going to lock my grid lines again. And you'll notice, because I've moved this ball up, this is actually now slightly short. So another tool we can use, which is the opposite of the trim tool, is the extend tool, to extend any lines down to meet a certain line we specify. So if you type in extend, it's exactly the same as the trim tool but in reverse. So we select the line we're extending to, hit enter, and then select the lines we want to extend. These two here. There we go, so that's now all joined up. Now the last thing we're going to cover in this session is this internal entrance here and these front doors. These are actually kind of the mirror of each other, and each one accesses a different flat. So this is the flat that sits above this flat, and this is the flat that sits below. So they're kind of opposite flats but with internal entrances that face each other. So to do that, I'm just going to want to cut a hole in my external wall here to have that entrance. And because I've got my centre line and I want these to be exactly the same on either side, I'm actually just going to do it on one side first and then mirror it over to the opposite side so they perfectly match. So I'm going to draw out a line here. It doesn't have to be too accurate for now because we can move it into place later. And one here to trim this bit of wall. Turn that reference off. We're then going to select those two lines and use the mirror tool to mirror them so they match on the other side. And then we're going to use them to trim out those excess lines we don't want. So just using the trim tool, and you see I've selected them all at the same time, and then I'm just going to go around and cut off the lines you want. This is important that you've locked your grid lines when you do this, because you don't want to accidentally cut your grid lines when you're trimming. Now the last tool I just want to share to help me tidy up these lines, so we could use the trim tool again just to trim off those edges, but another tool that's quite useful for doing this is the fillet tool. So if you just type in fillet, it's also found here. You can then, I've got a radius set to 0, and what that means is you can select two curves and they'll join at the corner with a 0 radius. So again, but what the fillet tool can also do is it can give a kind of radius or a curve to each of these corners. So if I then select the tool again, and instead of a radius 0, if we select the radius and type in 50, that will start to give a radius of 50 mil to these corners. So if I do that, you see then it starts to curve that off. And this is quite useful if you wanted to kind of round off any edges. Let's say on these external walls I actually wanted quite a large radius, we could do that. We could put it at a radius of 200, say. Round that off as well. So it gives you a bit more flexibility when sort of joining off those corners if you wanted to add that detail to it as well. So this is where I'm going to stop for this session, and we're going to be looking into drawing into this flat in more detail in the next session. We're going to actually start to use this reference less and less and start to actually draw in more detail in and add kind of internal wall partitions, add in cabinets, furniture, staircase detailing, and we're really going to be going into a lot of detail within this plan going forward. So this session was basically just covering the basic setup of the plan and some basic drawing techniques, and we'll be moving further in the next session. I'm going to go ahead and chop out the rest of these windows and doors and internal partitions to set up this drawing for the next stage. And in the next stage we're going to be drawing in more details like these windows here. We're going to be starting to detail in the staircase and handrails and using the array tool to help us with that. And then also start to draw in some of these door details and adding in dimensions and kind of more fine-tuned drawing pieces like these columns here.